Hello, everybody, and welcome to Sense of Healy. And today I have the pleasure to talk to Chris Jefferson. He's the CTO at Advai, and I will tell you more about it. But let's go and see what is it we're talking about today, which is AI sovereignty and adjoining topics. I've been doing a lot of podcasts on AI, but this is a topic that I never really went into, although it's clearly crucial and it's crucial to telecoms and everything else that uses AI. So it's a little bit broader topic, and it's really fascinating because clearly the question is, okay, we need AI, we use AI, AI is going to become more and more important. But what are the implications of that? How do we make sure that we get the best out of it and it doesn't become something dangerous? And clearly there is that risk. So how should we approach that? And this is somewhat complementary to um, a podcast that we did recently with Sebastian Barros about geopolitics and standards, where the current geopolitical climate is kind of creating a little bit of a challenge on the global reach of standards. And sovereignty and all of those issues are somewhat tied to the fact that, yeah, we every country, every operator, every person has to make sure we use AI in a fair way, a responsible and secure way. But this is to still advise. Uh, what is it? The key message. But at the same time, we also want to use AI, and like any technology has a global reach. So how can we have global, I mean, use allow every country, every person, every operator to use the global models that are technologies that's available globally, and use it in a way that is appropriate for that country, that person, or that operator. So, said that, Chris, welcome to Sparring Partners.
Thank you, Monica.
So, uh, before we do, you guys are a startup, which is the great thing about doing podcasts, that I can do more of podcasts with startups, and because there's always interesting what startups do. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got there, and about Advai?
Yeah, for sure. So we're getting old and grey hairs as a startup now. So we've been around for about 5 years, working within AI. Uh, Before this, I actually used to work in financial services. I used to do sort of governance, risk, compliance systems. So I was very much on sort of the enterprise side of systems. And actually, sort of the last few parts of my career there, I was working on a previous iteration of AI and chatbots, and sort of looking at sort of crypto and ledger technology. But I think what really kind of got us going into setting up Advai was actually my co-founder. He's ex-government, but he had sort of two questions that he really wanted to answer as to what was coming in with these new AI systems. And sort of the first one, which he couldn't get an answer for, was how can we verify that the system does what you say it does? And then the second question is, how can we understand when it's going to go wrong? And so the problem that he kept coming up against was that no one could answer either of these two rather fundamental questions to adoption. And so what we actually set up to do was we originally set up to look at understanding the challenges from AI failure relating to sort of security or vulnerabilities around sort of misuse. But over the years, we look at the whole life cycle now. So we try and understand from inception of an idea all the way through delivery and decommissioning of AI systems. How do you understand where those failure points are, who the right people are to have involved in the conversation, how you actually are able to get the information and the evidence to say and understand if you've got the right data, if the system's going to deploy correctly, scale, if you're able to actually use it in the environments that you want to use it, and ultimately make it so that you can accelerate adoption, but in a way that you're able to both evidence and sort of responsibly deploy these systems, because you need to be able to make informed decisions. And I think within that, there's this whole basis by which, if you're able to create this information in understanding how an AI system will behave, you can then also collect the information by which you're able to define how you control it. You release the value, you manage the risks, and so you can deploy it into more business critical situations. And then from there, this is the same information that you can then use to say, right, this is the information a regulator might need. This is the information we can provide for standards and governance. And so it was one of those pieces where, although we specialize in what causes systems to fail, and our research team has a great time breaking AI systems, it's the same information that we can use to then say, right, well, this is how you control that problem. This is how you deploy it faster. This is how you make AI an asset rather than a risk.
Well, and absolutely, because it's also, I would imagine that with AI, it generates so much data that is, some of it is potentially useful and it should be used in a, in an appropriate way, but then you don't want to misuse it either. So, on top of all the other issues. So, do you use AI to assure AI? Because at some point, you say you're gonna try to break down AI, but AI will be a useful tool to do that.
Yeah, and we do. I mean,
Mm.
the reality is there's a certain scale with some, especially with generative AI systems. I mean, they have such a large scope in which the information and the use cases can be probed and perceived. You need to use automation, AI, ML to be able to actually do some of the evaluations, some of the tests, and some of the monitoring. And so, yeah, there is this kind of weird thing of where it's, I'm thinking the saying is turtles all the way down, but it's AI models all the way down in terms of some of the evaluations you can look at. But one of the things we do look at is, you're trying, when you do need to use AI to monitor AI as well, you need to be able to understand, right, what is the confidence I can have in the system. And so you, in order to get sort of fundamentally signal for being able to monitor other AI systems, you need to use this AI to sort of generate the relevant signal. And then
Yeah.
from there, you need to be able to have fundamentally sort of much more rigid sort of logic and rules by which you can say, right, this is how we can assess that to be reliable. And so I think there's this really interesting subset of AI assessment and monitoring where, just out of pure necessity and feasibility, you do need to use AI to actually do some of the evaluation and the monitoring.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, and I guess this kind of points to the fact that you can get out of it, and it's a good thing, but also bad. What I'm saying, like, we need to learn to operate in a world where AI is pervasive. So
Yeah.
we need to, which makes it even more important to make sure that we use it well. That's true of everything. Like, cars. It's just that with cars, we've been using them for a long time, so we developed the system to make sure that cars are safe. Here, it's completely a new ground. And the other thing is that in the UK, and I might be partly biased because I spend most of my time there now. Um, there is, like UK Tin, which is where I learned about you guys. And there is a lot of activity. The government is actually pushing this, and I'm not saying that other countries don't, but it seems like UK is particularly good. What's your experience? I guess you're mostly based in the UK, but I bet you don't just work in the UK.
Yeah, no, we worked in sort of multiple regions, but I think on the UK perspective, they've had you're right. The government has had a real push in terms of this AI policy by which they're trying to promote and accelerate how fundamentally kind of the UK capability is able to support the AI ecosystem. And I think so. One of the larger pushes they've done, actually, there are two ends of the spectrum. There's on the one side, they've looked at kind of how can we improve the data infrastructure, how can we get the data centers by which you can have the information accessible for fundamentally AI systems. But at the other end, they've also been pushing things such as sort of the regulatory landscape. So I think sort of with the likes of sort of NVIDIA, the FCA, they've been promoting sort of live testing sandboxes. So I think there is sort of a concerted effort to make sure that the UK is prepared for and able to use AI. But I think in certain areas, the UK is still playing catch up. And I think one of those areas is actually fundamentally in infrastructure. Because there still is ongoing and a long-term investment needed to keep sort of that infrastructure developing. And I think when I say infrastructure, obviously, we're including the telecoms networks in terms of, sort of data communication, but there's also the need for power, for water, for the fundamental requirements for operating data centers as well. And so I think the UK has made a concerted effort of late to actually push that to the forefront of policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really complex because I say it just touches, it's not just which LLM model you're using. It's much broader than that. So, okay, why don't we sort of like, okay, uh, sovereignty in AI is like everybody's talking about it, but how do you see what are the major issues here? And who is, what's the problem?
With sovereign AI. So I think one of the challenges is it's kind of an uneven race that's going on. So you have effectively sort of different global powers who are pushing and promoting sort of the use of sort of AI and trying to build sovereign models. And I think there is a good justification behind it because ultimately sovereign capability means that there is more scope for control, for safety, for being able to protect and reduce exposure to harms. And I think there is a very useful edict there where ultimately sovereign AI at its heart is trying to promote responsible and safe usage of systems whilst protecting your citizens. And so it's an important investment in the technology. But equally, when you look at some of the challenges there, it's sort of asynchronous in terms of, sort of the capability progression and sort of who's moving forward. And so you tend to see in sort of the global north, that's something that's sort of really pushed. And so you have sort of the larger uh, geopolitical powers who are able to actually invest in the infrastructure. They're able to invest in the training of models, the collection of data. They have the commercial ecosystems which kind of promote this already. But then if you look at sort of just for argument for the global south, then there's not that capability there. Sort of support for data centers isn't there. There's also the lack of capability of making that available in house in terms of having stability of infrastructure to run these systems. So I think one of the things that we'll see as kind of one of the challenges here is that as sovereign AI progresses, it may also be imported into other regions, and sort of other regions will become reliant on sort of other countries to be able to actually run an AI capability. But a challenge within this is that sovereign AI has the potential to also promote bias and sort of a misbalance of information. And so one of the challenges that you do see a lot in how AI systems are progressing is that they're a component of the data they've been trained on. And so if you're dealing with data at a sort of geographical level, you'll have sort of representative information for your countries, for your population, for your culture, but that might not necessarily translate to being used in another part of the world. I mean, one of the common things is what is ethical in one country may not be ethical in another country, and so how sovereign capability runs between different regions is going to be interesting because ultimately it's been trained and optimized to a slightly different outcome. So I think it's the beginning of an interesting geopolitical race that's going to be playing out over the next decade.
It really is, and I guess that what AI does, it makes it the scale of that problem it's much bigger because everybody can be biased. But if you or I are biased, it's just a limited impact. But clearly, if a model is biased, it could have a different impact in the same way that you have with social media and stuff like that. And at the same time, as you say, some things that might be ethical in one country is not in another country, but you also do not want to restrict the content to whatever is available in that country. So at some point, there is a question of freedom of speech or being able to say what you want to say, and on the other hand, to respect what each country, the sensitivity and what every country is deems to be appropriate. So some things might be acceptable and some things might be outright illegal. in a country. So there is a different degrees, so there is a different shades there. So how do you think we should balance? And also in all this, regardless of where we personally are in the world, we can still access stuff, content, models from everywhere in the world. So you can't just say, hey, when you are within the UK, you can't just get content from other countries. You do all the time. So
Yeah.
how do we think about that?
Well, I think there's sort of 2 points to how I respond there. So I think on the one hand, sovereign AI is kind of a sort of a national capability fundamentally, and
Mm,
so one of the things that's great about the AI community is actually it's a huge open source community. It's a global community of researchers, data scientists, engineers, and one of the things that's been done to great effectiveness is the accessibility to open source models, the accessibility to alternatives in terms of tools that you can use and how you train information into them. And so I think that is a huge strength. It's a huge strength and it's a huge risk as well. I mean, it's in terms of how the final person uses it, but ultimately it means that there is always an alternative available. And so because AI is still very much at the frontier of what is possible within computer science, it's sort of constantly progressing in terms of that frontier. So I think having access to that community is very important. I think the second piece is very much around sort of standards and ultimately sort of this regulatory landscape as well, because I think there's an interesting point in terms of how different regions are pursuing the regulatory outcomes and how that is being promoted as sort of at a national level. But ultimately, that is regional standards at the moment, and so each country is working on their own AI action plans and their own sort of AI regulations. But the really cool thing behind that is actually the unsung hero is the likes of the standards coming out of sort of NIST, the ISO, the work coming out of the OECD. They're also
mhm.
pressing things forwards in terms of how do you address sort of bias in data? How do you manage the governance of systems? How do you make it so that you can actually effectively red team AI systems as well? And so this is all progressing quietly in the background. And I think the key there is you need standards for interoperability. You need standards to make sure that systems can work across borders. But then you also need standards by which you can then define how you actually get the controls in place. And so I think it's between and these are two very different things, between like the wild progression of open source, but also the progression of standards in terms of how we can make everything kind of click together. I think those are two very good levers with which we can start to pull on of taking advantage of this new technology, but also being able to deploy it in a consistent and interoperable way that ultimately is aimed at helping society.
Yeah, and I guess, having well, first of all, open source sources, it clearly it increases the transparency.
Mm.
Because oftentimes people think, okay, AI is a black box. Just to some extent, it is, in the sense that you don't go and see exactly what happened in there. But on the other hand, if you know what the model is, what the assumptions are, that helps in understanding what is coming out at the end. And so I guess we have two things: that we need to have the standards that allow the technology to develop at a global scale along the right path. And then each country has the opportunity to, refine it.
Yeah, and I think it's each, and I think this comes back to culture. So for each country, they need to do what's right for their region, and so they
Mhm.
need to work out how to apply AI in a way that is good for their citizens. But I think the open source piece equalizes the playing field to a certain degree. It means that even if there is a sovereign capability being developed in one region, it means that actually another region can sort of take advantage of this open source community to a degree. Conversely, it does also introduce an interesting risk because even though you can bring in open source systems, it does introduce an interesting supply chain challenge because these systems are also they're also well known. They're open to say, an adversarial community that is able to look at how they can manipulate them. They're open to challenges around what have they been trained on. And so I think there's risks and benefits in all of this. And I think the question that you've got to really answer is that the reason AI is being adopted is because it has a huge potential and incredible value to society as a whole. And so there are problems that AI could solve that we as humans would be struggling away at by ourselves for many, many years. And so although there are these risks, there's still the need to work out how can I adopt these systems whilst managing that risk and release the value in them. So it's one of those things that this is something that has to be solved at sort of a global level in terms of how do we make sure that this isn't imbalanced. But ultimately, we also need to make sure that we don't get paralyzed by the concerns over sort of taking advantage of these options and not doing something just because we're scared that there's an unmanageable risk.
Absolutely. And also, you mentioned bad actors, and bad actors have access to open source just the same as everybody else. So, isn't there a risk that if a country, if, well, most countries implement rules that are too strict, we are basically going to give an advantage to all the bad actors because they can do all the kind of things that we cannot do. You see what I'm saying? So that it just kind of reduces our ability to sort of compete, not compete, but to fight them.
Yeah, and I think this is a great example of kind of how bad actors they're fundamentally they aren't working by the same ethical or moral rule
Yeah.
book that we are, and so they you're right, they have access to this whole library of capabilities which they can use in different ways, and their tolerance for sort of when something goes wrong is much higher because ultimately they're just
Okay.
trying to get a very specific outcome. I think I think the challenge here is that there are always bad actors, and likely over the sort of the next sort of 5 to 10 years, we're going to see this uptick in sort of AI-enabled adversarial activity. But as sort of a global society, we will kind of adjust to that. And I think the one of the reasons that we need to adjust to that is because this is, as I say, it's a sort of a wonderful capability in terms of what the potential is. And so there will always be bad actors trying to sort of circumvent systems or circumvent for personal gain. And so within there, really what you need to understand is, right, how can I deploy with the knowledge that bad actors will be out there trying to sort of take advantage of AI to say improve phishing campaigns, automate how identity theft could be done, whatever fraud it might be that they want to follow through. It's given that knowledge of how they may operate. I still want to adopt this capability because for me as an organization or for me as a sovereign state, this will actually help my employees. This will help my company, and it's ultimately within there. It's you have to then understand a bad actor will try and extract or look for the weakest point in your company or your society and try and sort of extract information to some other gain. Given that knowledge, you can still adopt AI and you can still use it and deploy it. It's just a case of just having a bit of knowledge about how it will fail when they do, so that you're able to say, right, at least I can recognize this problem, I can control it, and I can then release the value for my people.
Now, you mentioned regulation and government, but clearly there are different levels here. So you have governments that are going to say, okay, well, that's okay, that's not okay. Cool. Not that it's easy. It's extremely complicated, and we don't even know what is that. This is regardless of who's going to make the decision, regardless about the country. It's very hard to predict because it's something that it's being developed. So to regulate something that is not quite there, it's really hard in the best case. And here it has so many implications. But it's not just the government, and it's just not just regulation. So there is so there's government top level, but then you have the service providers, network operators, hyperscalers that they're going to have their own uh, probably more restrictive regulations and whatever. And then you have service, I mean app developers, I mean the people that do actually use those models. Then there are those models, and then there are individuals like us outside of work that you might want to say this is acceptable to me or not. That's your own personal decision. So how should we think about the issue of safety, of having a safe and useful AI, not just from the point of government? How does it percolate down all the way to the users?
Yeah, so I might go the other way up. I'll go from the
Okay,
user.
same
Okay.
thing.
So I think as individuals, there is a kind of a need to understand sort of how can I use AI to my personal benefit. And so I think the perception of risk from individuals is one of two things. It's either from a very informed user or it's from someone who is uh, uh, less experienced in the technology. And so within there, it's ultimately for them, it's understanding that if we're looking at say LLMs, for instance, the information that is generated from them is very it's tuned to us as humans, so it's very intuitive. It's designed to sort of feel like how we talk, and to be honest, it's an incredible interface
Yeah.
for humans.
Hmm.
And so I think the point there is just being able to, as an individual, just look at this information slightly critically and understand, right, I don't need to just trust this verbatim, but I can just make informed decisions off it, and I can use it to guide my thinking. And so I think for individuals, it's learning how AI can augment what you want to do, not fully relying on it. It's kind of this very useful ability to augment you. For organizations and by proxy sort of governments as well who are using AI, it's more related to understanding, right, I have to understand the potential harms that I can be impacting upon my customers, my constituents, my employees, whatever it may be. And within that, they're trying to understand actually what is the impact of using AI. As is it going to cause harm? Is it going to cause harm to my customers? Is it going to displace my employees? And so they're trying to look at understanding for those categories of risk, uh, how can they control it? And that risk also extends to sort of operational and infrastructure, because you're trying to understand, right, if I release AI on my systems, is that just going to go rogue and suddenly I've got information leaking out left, right, and center? And so they're trying to understand it from the perspective of how do I make sure that I'm not ultimately legally culpable for what we're providing as a service to our customers, that I'm not discriminating against my employees, and that I'm protecting my information. And so currently that's usually driven by existing data protection regulations, existing sort of consumer care, existing sort of laws around how you provide services. And so there's this kind of quasi legal mandate, but also aspirational protection of society that is kind of informing that. And I think that kind of leads into this last layer, which is the regulatory layer that's sitting on top of this, and sort of how that is informed by new legislation that's coming out around AI. And so the challenge at the moment for regulators is they need to know, right, what questions do I need to ask of the sectors that I'm regulating, by which I can say, right, this is a responsible approach to using AI. This is a way to demonstrate that you're taking due care and attention, or this is what you need to search for in terms of transparency, in terms of auditability, and sort of protection against biases or other harms. And so the regulators have this challenge where they're both being pushed by and serviced by governments to actually both set out the rule sheets, but they also have to learn at the same time as they're going for some of this as well. So I think it's a really challenging space for them at the moment. But ultimately, I think the best standards, and like the leading regulation at the moment is the EU AI Act. As of August 2025, that has now become sort of active in terms of different requirements for things such as transparency, and that is very practical, because it's saying, right, we need to look at this on a use case by use case basis, because not every use case is equal, and depending on how it's being used, you'll be exposed to different types of risk. And so it's quite a practical approach in terms of defining that although AI can be used very generally, you can't necessarily and effectively regulate sort of a general scope. There are some things that can be generalized, but ultimately you need to get down into the specifics of how it's being used. And I think, I mean, even for us as a company, we use that as a way of constraining the scope in terms of how you understand how systems are going to fail, because if you try and do it for every potential AI use in an AI system, you don't have an effective way of managing that failure. So I think, yeah, I think within that there's different layers of priorities in terms of how across those different tiers it is being used. But when it gets to the end of the list, if you come back to us as individuals, we just want to use AI to make our lives a little bit better. And so I think it's as long as we understand we can do that, but we can't rely on it verbatim.
Yeah, and that would be like a whole different podcast. Very interesting to understand what is that people need to know without becoming data scientists. So there is a question of how do you get to that level. But let me ask you kind of a final question, which is, I guess that what you said is like you guys are going to have so much work to do because there's so many things to make sure everything works perfectly. Oh, not perfectly, sufficiently well, I would say. That I think it would be. I think we would settle on that.
Yeah.
So, but how does it work? Because okay, so like the EU has this, good regulatory framework in place. Okay, cool. But who's gonna check? Who is responsible? So, do you see the governments to have some sort of like, let's make sure, let's do some auditing, like they do with taxes. They'll audit you if they suspect you're doing something wrong. Or is it that every, say, operator or hyperscaler or whoever it is out there that uses AI or the AI model companies have to produce a report like they do for energy? They say, okay, we are complying with everything. Or
Yeah.
none of the above. Who's
Well,
who's enforcing it? Or
it's
who's checking?
so it's all of the above in a way. So I think there's sort of limited regions where regulation is enforced, but now it's sort of the main ones are certain states in the US. You've got sort of likes of the EU and sort of China as well, for instance. But the thing that the regulators are sort of trying to pull back is they need to have this sort of fundamentally this audited reporting coming back to them, because they need to be able to understand, right, we
Is that
are
working?
getting
Yeah.
it.
Mhm.
And so they're trying to define the rule book by which then companies or other institutions can send this information back to them. And then on the AI producers, the providers, the hyperscalers, they need to also, if they're using AI or if they're creating AI as well, they need to define the system cards and say, right, this is how the system's been created. This is how it should be used. This is where it sort of should be applied and not applied. And so within them, there is an obligation on them where they need to say, right, this is all the due care and attention we've tried to take to create a safe system. And then the final piece is that along with the regulators and the model providers, any organization that's adopting AI, they have to take a kind of a proportionate risk-based approach by which they can say, right, these are the AI systems that we're looking at, these are the ones that we've got, and this is how we're applying it to our customers. So all the way through, there's this need for people to take a certain degree of ownership, because and this is one of the challenges with AI at the moment. There's so much information, and there's also a lot of unknowns still. And because we're looking at this fundamentally like this new generation of AI and sort of ML systems that have appeared in the last 15 years and really exploded in the last 2 or 3, what we're seeing is that actually the control space and how we can adopt that and deploy that's still playing catch up. And so it's because of that, there is this onus on everyone that's involved to just take a little part of ownership to be able to make sure that that is collected.
Yeah, and I think it's the scale is really the sort of the scary part. um, because it's this is taking everybody, I would say, by surprise how quickly we're starting to use it, and
Yeah.
that growth is going to continue. It's not like we are at peak, not at all. We are kind of, and so it's not just that the challenge is big; it's the scale, it's the volume. It's
And
not just
yeah,
sitting there, you know.
it's one of the great things. I mean, deep learning has sort of released this value in all of these sort of stores and silos of data, and suddenly like the first iteration of AI, where it was just looking at models, that's kind of released this ability to do analysis that was previously unavailable. But what I find very interesting is how we're starting to enter into this sort of agentic era where you have networks of AI models and systems interacting with data, interacting with user interfaces, communicating with each other. And like the potential for how they could be used is incredible, but it does pose a very interesting sort of control problem because they operate at speeds that we can't. And as how do you define and implement human control within a system that is ultimately operating faster than you can think about what you're going to have for lunch today? So it does pose, as again, I think this is a theme in terms of what I've been saying. There's a huge opportunity here, but there's also a risk that we just need to work out how do we control for that risk and not expose ourselves to things that will ultimately lead to a net negative for society.
And you cannot close the gate.
Yeah,
We don't want to, but it's not like you say, okay, let's slow down here. We just that's not, which was at some point on the table, like, let's just take 6 months break. What was it gonna do? Then
yeah, and I
it's
think
like it's this is not a solution. We just have to deal with whatever is gonna
no,
come.
I think it's at the moment we're in a sprint marathon at the moment. So we're all running as fast as we can, but it's a marathon, and so it's everyone's sort of both excited but trying to keep up. And I think I mean, even in the last month, if you just look at, say, the regulatory space, like there's been multiple AI action plans coming out. So the regulations have updated, standards have been updated in AI. And so there's all of that going on one side. And then on the other side, you have sort of releases of new models. You have new tools by which models can interact with data, with user interfaces. And so there's this huge pace of innovation going on, but you need to keep up because this is a new wave of fundamentally how we as humans will interact with information, and the technology is going very fast.
Absolutely. And you're gonna have a lot of work, I'm sure. So, Chris, thank you so much for sharing your insights and view with us. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure, Monica. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
Thank you, and thank you all for listening in. And do continue listening to Spare Partners. Sign up for the feed and let other people know as well.